welcome to the World Affairs Council of New Jersey, our conversation with Alexander Vindman. We're thrilled that he's here. I think we have a good showing online, Shweta. Good, and so hello to everybody online. So we're trying to do our hybrid format tonight. So we have some folks online and we have Alex and I. I should just say John Gans, who's supposed to moderate, was not feeling well. And when people are not feeling well, we're decided not to bring him into a crowded room. But he is actually going to try and join us for a few questions in the middle of our conversation, mainly about the NSC, which he's an expert. So he'll be joining for a bit in the middle of the program. So let me just start with a quick note about the World Affairs Council of New Jersey, which I think many of you are becoming familiar with, but we're dedicated to bringing independent, timely, and thought-provoking programs on world events and U.S. foreign policy to our communities here in New Jersey. We're proud to be serving the great state of New Jersey, which is one of the country's most global states. Our website has lots more information and provides opportunities to donate or to join. So tonight we're incredibly pleased to have Alexander Vindman join us. He's going to share some insights from a distinguished career in the U.S. military, as well as some parts of his personal story. Much of tonight's conversation is going to draw on his recent memoir, Here, Right Matters, An American Story. If you haven't gotten your book signed already, there will be an opportunity again at the end of the evening. Alex enjoyed a distinguished 21-year career in the U.S. Army, rising to the rank of Lieutenant Colonel before retiring in 2020. Since then, Alex has written his memoir and begun studying for his doctorate. He's not just begun studying for his doctorate, he's actually almost finished studying for his doctorate, which I just learned, which he's going to defend this spring. He's also a senior fellow at the SAIS Foreign Policy Institute, and he is the Pritzker Military Fellow at the Lawfare Institute. Prior to his retirement, Alex served as Director for European Affairs on the National Security Council from 2018 to 2020. Previous, he had served as the Political Military Affairs Officer for Russia on the Joint Staff and as an attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. Commissioned as an infantry officer, Alex received the Purple Heart for wounds received in an IED attack in Iraq. He was born in Ukraine and emigrated with his family to the United States in 1979. He grew up in Brooklyn. Alex, thanks very much for being here today. So, of course, you became famous for some events that occurred sort of spring, summer, fall of 2019 that took place inside the White House. And I promise everyone we will get there pretty quickly. But I did want to kind of start a little bit farther back because I found one of the most interesting parts of your book was when you were describing sort of some of your early family life, some of your family history. And it struck me that when we fast forward to 2019, we're going to see that you drew on a lot of those personal experiences and those values. So can you maybe tell everybody a little bit about your upbringing, kind of your family history in Ukraine, what you had your dad brought you here, kind of what your growing up in Brooklyn was like?
Sure. First of all, thanks, Roz, and the World Affairs Council of New Jersey, Seton Hall School of Diplomacy and International Relations. I appreciate and the folks watching and John for moderating. I have to say that I really like this format of starting with the signed books first, because now people can't return them. So I'm going to incorporate that into the future. So I get there's something to be said about the way I wrote this book was to answer two questions: why and how. Why, what was the context for the decision I made? What was at stake? And the how, which is drawing on all of the entirety of my background, the entirety of my experiences, including how I grew up as a refugee kid, resettling from the Soviet Union, fleeing from the Soviet Union, settling in New York, and as a young man growing up in New York City. And I think I intentionally looked back at what I thought might be key moments of my life and the experiences that informed my decisions on those two questions, how and why. And one of the conclusions I came up with is context. My upbringing as a refugee hearing about because I was too young to really remember. We came over when I was 4.5 years old, but hearing the stories of my family history in the Soviet Union, the fact that both my paternal and maternal grandfathers died in World War II in service in defense of the Soviet Union at the time, and understanding my father's flight from the Soviet Union, the reasons for that, added this key component of context.
Mhm.
I understood that there are places in this world where people have to face far more fundamental challenges than creature comforts and material gains, and that spoke that background as a growing up with modest means. Although I didn't recognize, I thought my family was as far as it was a happy family life, so I didn't really know that there was more out there. But I had that context, especially as I grew up, recognizing that there was something different about the United States, and that's where that journey of context, understanding how the U.S. was different, how the U.S. was exceptional, originated from my experience as a young man.
Yeah, and I have this a fun scene in the book where you and your twin brother are obviously getting into trouble again, right? So there's lots of
Yeah.
fun scenes, but I do have this memory of there's a part in the book where they're trying to get through the streets of Brooklyn without ever touching the streets of Brooklyn.
Right.
So, on the fire hydrants and up on the brownstone, but it was just really charming. But it did kind of sort of paint a picture of a very active young man, right? I think, and you said school was sort of like for a while, and you ended up at SUNY Binghamton.
Right.
And then you describe in the book kind of a journey, kind of a toward the Army. And then that became an incredibly important sort of home for you as an adult, and also shaped a lot of your values. Can you maybe talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So I think in this earlier phase, there was a lot of energy, and there was very little focus in that phase of my life. And it wasn't that school was difficult. We were in all the honors classes and took the APs and stuff like that. It's just that wasn't necessarily, even though we liked learning, we actually enjoyed learning. For whatever reason, we weren't sufficiently engaged. I mean, it's possible now we would have been diagnosed as ADHD or whatever the case might be, and we grew out of that with some focus and some discipline. But at the time, even though we finished pretty well, it wasn't really the focal point or the key area of interest, and that's probably one of the key reasons that I have such a deep appreciation for the military, is that my late bloomer, my blossoming kind of coincided with joining the military after finishing university, and things came to a point of sorts where I was looking to be more disciplined and more focused. The military offered me an outlet for all my excess energies, and being an infantryman, airborne ranger is pretty exciting stuff, and serving in Korea, being charged with leading a platoon of 43 soldiers with a real world mission where we with a threat of, at the time, this was before the global war on terror, where the threat of war was not distant and the stakes were really high. We were within field artillery range of North Korean artillery, well within it. I mean, we were within mortar range, like right on the border, and having something to focus on, having to prepare a unit for combat. All of those things seem to come together, and again generate this kind of interest, intense focus and passion for military service, for public service, that I again would draw on later on in life. But those were the seeds that kind of were planted in the fertile ground of military and public service.
Yeah, and then you do spend some time in the book also talking a little bit about Iraq and your service there. And I think that connection that you make between kind of the planning that you did in Korea, right? And that I can't remember exactly how you said it, but something that you like to lean in you liked to push a
Yeah.
little in terms of sort of military planning, campaign, and
Sure.
try things. And so maybe you could talk a little bit about
Yeah.
that, and also what did you learn in Iraq? I mean, what kind of experience did you have?
I think that's right. I think I don't know if I could quite pinpoint where some of this some of these tendencies came from, but I was always willing to. I had a strong sense of what was potentially right and what was wrong, and I don't know if it. I don't want to overstate that, especially to young folks that are trying to figure out how they would navigate difficult affairs. But I had some seeds of that. I think those were learned from my father. He didn't broach, dishonesty, and I carried that forward from him and try to instill it in my daughter. So that was the early seeds, and then I adopted a value set, Army values. We have this kind of mnemonic device to remember them: loyalty, duty, respect, selfless service, honor, integrity, personal courage, leadership. And I started to build on my kind of rough foundation of ethics and values in those in that early career, because again, I wasn't just responsible for myself. I was responsible for a larger number of soldiers. By the time I become a captain in Iraq, I'm getting ready to take a formation of 176 soldiers and millions of dollars of equipment, and trying to build a organization that requires, in order to be successful in combat, requires more than just kind of tactical and technical proficiency. They need to be morally strong. They need to be courageous. They need to understand, how their efforts are contributing to the mission. And this is the way I kind of start to exercise what I refer to as my ethics and values muscle. I had some sort of foundation, and I start to practice this in uniform, whether it's leading my organization, occasionally seeing that things are awry and I need to make the correction. It's easier to do that when you're a superior officer, to correct junior soldiers, but sometimes you have to do the same thing up. And the military doesn't discourage that. You just have to be tactful, understand how to do that in a very professional manner where you're not putting your senior leaders on the spot. Again, a skill that comes in handy later on, trying to when I report the phone call, I do it through proper channels, and not in a way that I thought could help the president make a correction to his ill-considered corrupt enterprise. So these are things that, again, I start building as a younger guy and practicing. And one of the things I guess I mentioned, I talk about with regards to combat, and is this notion of staying kind of cool, calm, and collected under intense pressure. And you don't really quite know how you're going to respond in those types of situations. You get a lot of training, you think you might know, but you don't necessarily know. And what I realized in those moments, and I talk about only one of them. There were other times responding to sniper fire, other kinds of attacks, but that one was where I was injured. I was able to fall back on my training. That discipline that I lacked as a younger guy started to come into play. I knew exactly what I was supposed to do to respond to that situation, and didn't succumb to kind of fears or anything else. Again, everything seems to build on itself, as I move forward and get more seasoned and put time and experience together.
Yeah, so I'm going to move into one more thing, and then John, I think we'll go to you. I'm just going to ask one more question, which is, so after Iraq, you're coming back and you're actually kind of moving into a different career area, which is a foreign affairs officer. For people who may not know, they're Army officers or naval officers who basically begin to specialize in a region and become sort of senior military political advisors within the Department of Defense or within the national security enterprise. And that was the direction that you decided ultimately you wanted to go. So what does that entail? And you could tell us maybe quickly of the,
Sure.
the attaché, you have the pole mill, and then we're going to get to, because this is where Alex is really beginning to move very squarely into the Russia and Ukraine issues.
So at some point in your career, once you are master the basics, although that's kind of a stretch, once you meet your career milestones, you have that opportunity to select some specialties. And I enjoyed being an infantryman, but I also understood that the next 5-7 years might be more mundane, not leading troops, but being a staff officer, which is far less exciting. And I also evaluated that I had a skill set somewhat unique in that I was a heritage Russian speaker, and this was in about 2007, before Russia's serious pivot to more aggressive posture, but already kind of in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference, Putin made a statement about where he saw Russia's role and much more aggressive position towards NATO expansion and so forth. And I thought this is an area I could contribute. So it's a selective process to join the ranks of the foreign area officers, but you also get to do some pretty awesome stuff. I picked up another language. I spoke Russian. They trained me in Ukrainian. They gave me a nice, healthy budget to, while residing in Ukraine, travel throughout the former Soviet space. So I covered basically everything, all those former Soviet republics, and traveled to China to understand the relationship between Russia and China. Same thing in Turkey, same thing to Poland, and received an advanced degree from Harvard, regional studies and international relations, and then went off to be a foreign area officer in kind of the World Series, going straight into Moscow as an attaché, which was pretty fantastic. A fantastic place to land, to see exactly how the Russians were operationalizing this more aggressive posture that I had alluded to with regards to hybrid warfare, spending enormous amounts of money on rearmament, and seeing how they're learning from NATO, how they were prepared to respond asymmetrically because they couldn't compete necessarily on a one-for-one basis with the U.S. military or the Euro-Atlantic Alliance, but how they were developing this hybrid warfare approach, and watching the Russians implement that when they annexed Ukraine, or annexed Crimea, attacked eastern Ukraine, attempted to really create a failed state out of Ukraine. And having all that experience behind me, and witnessing firsthand what the Russians were doing, that's what landed me in the Pentagon as the Russia Affairs Officer for the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs.
Yeah. Okay, John, this is like, as the expert on the NSC, I think a good place for you maybe to jump in. Hopefully.
Absolutely. Well, it's good to see everybody, and see you, Alex. I'm sorry to miss you, and good to be with you, Roz. Thanks for having me back, and apologies to everybody. But I think, childhood diseases, you all don't want anything to do with them in terms of little kids and colds. So I thought it was the better move to stay home today. But I do appreciate a chance to join you here today. And I guess my first question for you, Alex, is, what did you feel like when you heard you were going to the White House to work on the National Security Council? And, you joined in 2018, right? So what did you find? What did you expect? How did you feel when you got the assignment? And then what did you find when you got there?
Yeah, so I'll spend maybe just a moment talking about how all of these things, you don't just land at the National Security Council. I came to the attention of the National Security Council because of my experience in Moscow, and then my experience at the Pentagon. I came into the Pentagon in 2015, just as in the months and year after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and a pivot away from global war on terror to great power competition. We somehow took our eye off the fact that nation state actors that are perpetual actually pose a threat to us. And it's not just about about counterinsurgency operations. And while I was at the Pentagon, I was responsible for the chairman's interaction with his Russian counterpart. So the chairman called a chief of the general staff. I translated for those conversations when cruise missiles were flying into Syria and Russians were on the base that they were landing on. I authored the kind of the key documents to focus us back on great power competition, about focus on Russia as an adversary. And in so doing, the White House recognized that there's an opportunity to take what was a document focused on the entire defense enterprise, this massive behemoth of defense, and elevate it out to the entirety of government. And they invited me up there for that reason. And of course, John gets this because he wrote a book on it, excellent book called White House Warriors. It is just a phenomenal opportunity to land in the White House. For me, it wasn't a fluke. I remember a conversation in 2013, sitting in the ambassador's residence called Spaso House in Moscow, talking to Ambassador McFaul, Mike McFaul, and saying, asking, what do you think about me, trying to get a position at the NSC? And with some keen encouragement from him, I started to figure out how I could potentially get over there. So it's something that I'd worked towards, something that I was really interested in doing, and walking those hallowed halls of the White House, the West Wing, the old executive office building, Eisenhower Executive Office Building, was something that it's hard to describe, because even after a year or 2 years, coming up on 2 years there, you do not lose your sense of awe of walking through there and recognizing that you're actually able to do some pretty amazing things, do some good for the country. I had committed myself to public service and national defense, and I was actually able to do something, managing U.S. policy towards Russia, towards Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus, eventually the Caucasus. It was a awesome opportunity that I cherished, along with a lot of the other opportunities that the military granted me. But this was now no longer in uniform. I didn't show up. I showed up, kind of like this, in a business suit, convening at the Deputy Assistant Secretary level U.S. policy and developing U.S. policy towards Russia and Ukraine and the rest of it. But you know that, John.
Yeah, I know a little bit of it, but partly because you've written such a great book, and I think you tell, the ordinary part of your job very well, but it didn't stay ordinary for your entire tenure. Now, most NSC staffers stay on the NSC for about 2 years, right? I think that's the average tenure in the NSC, and really you had a year of relatively normal and ordinary, and then things changed to somewhat extraordinary. Probably at the same day your life was divided between what you would consider ordinary and what became extraordinary. So on Thursday, July 25th, 2019, you listened in on a conversation. Explain why you were listening and what your job had been in the call, and what you were expecting, and then why things changed.
So you're right that was an inflection point, and maybe there's still a way to kind of avoid being drawn into the public eye for a short time afterwards. But what had happened is, like you pointed out, the first almost year was normal. I was conducting the business of the NSC, crafting a U.S. policy towards Russia and Ukraine, and for much of that, the president was disinterested about what was going on. I mean, my first day on the job was a bit of a wake-up call. I showed up to the NSC on July 16th, 2018. Most of you would know this because that was when the President Trump conducted his press conference with Vladimir Putin. And that was a bit of a wake-up call for any misconceptions that this was going to be an easy assignment. And for Fiona Hill, my boss, it was also a recognition that it was going to be very challenging to do a muscular U.S. policy with regards to Russia, although we still managed to do that somewhat successfully. If the president was about engaging and being, friendlier to Putin, the rest of the government was quite focused on fulfilling what was another aspect of the president's own policy, which was countering Russian malign influence and Russian aggression. So that was what I was doing for roughly the first year. Sometime in 2019, U.S. politics started to creep into what should have been purely national security issues. And this, again, the public is familiar with this because Ambassador Yovanovitch was eventually removed from her post in Ukraine. That was ultimately triggered by Don Jr., the president's child, tweeting something negative about her and how she wasn't supporting the president. And that's why she was ultimately recalled, even though we tried to keep her in position because she was a terrific public servant. And then over the subsequent weeks, seeing the president and his cronies roll out a strategy to coerce an investigation by the Ukrainians into the president's chief rival, at the time, Vice President Biden. So what I on the one hand, I'm trying to advance U.S. national security interests by nurturing a relationship with this brand new president, untrained president. He's a comedian whose background was as a comic. He played the part of a president that was kind of ushered into office by just some sort of fluke. And then, the hijinks are him trying to learn how to be a president. Anyway, so this character ends up materializing in real life. And our policy was to try to bring this guy along, develop a relationship in which the U.S. could help him to undertake anti-corruption measures, to conduct reforms, to strengthen Ukrainian sovereignty as the Russians were attacking Ukraine. They were continuously attacking it. And the president and his cronies, initially, it was really his cronies, were the ones that were conducting this pressure campaign against Ukraine. And my job as the belly button for the White House was to try to keep the U.S. policy on course, moving forward, strengthening the U.S. hand with regards to relationship and competition with Russia. And just to bring this to a point, when I went into that phone call, it was the second time that the president had conducted a phone call with President Zelensky. The first one was relatively normal. I mean, actually, it was a successful phone call. He called him the day that President Zelensky won a landslide victory in his presidential election. This one was another congratulatory phone call because this new party that President Zelensky had created just weeks before, for the first time in Ukraine's history, had won a majority in the Duma. So now this president that's a reformer could roll out a policy on the strength of his own political party and introduce legislation to conduct reforms. And that's why this phone call was so critical, and that's why I set it up. At the same time, the president, his office had put a hold on security assistance. So going to this phone call, I was of two minds. This is an opportunity to put this relationship back on track. This could completely blow up into something unseemly. And I went into that phone call. I write about this in the book, apprehensive and hopeful about how things were going to turn out.
Well, things obviously turned out on your apprehensions were warranted. I don't want to spend the whole time deliberating about this. I know Roz wants to get to audience questions, but I guess my question for you is, I think what's interesting about your book and what's I think so telling about it is that you sort of knew your life was changing very rapidly, very quickly. I think one of the neat things about the book is that you're able to sort of share it and have this experience with your friends and your family and your wife, who have to, you sort of immediately go and see your brother who is working with you at the NSC, which is not the usual thing for NSC staffers. They usually don't get to have their brother and their best friend there. And then your wife and your father also have to react to this news in very interesting ways. And I think, I don't want to recount the whole tale, but I guess how did how did you learn from watching how they reacted to what you heard and what you saw and what you decided to do between your dad, your brother, and your wife? How did they all sort of deal with it? And what did you learn from that experience of watching them living through this historical moment that you endured and they did as well?
Sure. So I recognized, I think there's this question comes up all the time, but there's this scene where after the phone call, I mean, immediately I almost as soon as the president joined the phone call, I could tell that this was going to be a very, very difficult phone call. He would describe himself as low energy Donald Trump, but he was a reluctant participant in the phone call. And really the only time he perked up was when President Zelensky said, I'd like to buy some of these weapon systems that are critical to defending my country. And President Trump responds with, I'd like you to do us a favor though, and then proceeds to kind of spin out a bunch of conspiracy theories that had no substance to them. And when he thought that President Zelensky said, if you have information, pass it to me, I'll conduct a transparent, legitimate investigation. That was to President Trump, not necessarily being the most sophisticated actor. He thought he received what he wanted. He was going to get this investigation into Joe Biden, derail Joe Biden's candidacy as a contender for the 2020 ticket, and that he perked up. But I knew exactly at this point, I knew almost everything I needed to know before I went into that phone call. I watched this enterprise unfold over the preceding weeks. I'd pulled this enterprise out of the shadows. If it was occurring like through you have a process that you follow in the National Security Council where you convene these meetings at the deputy assistant secretary level. The next level up is assistant secretary level, then deputy, and then the principals, the cabinet officials. And what I did was when this hold on security assistance unfolded, this pressure campaign unfolded, it occurred in completely these channels where imagine a hold being substantiated on the basis of a memo that's supposed to go to Congress to let them know that these funds are going to Ukraine by law, directed towards Ukraine, have to be spent on Ukraine, and somebody saying, well, I don't like the way that's written. The language in there doesn't appeal to me. That was the basis of the whole substantively. So I took it out of this kind of like completely spurious channel and put it into the national security process, made everybody go on record saying what were their views, and confirmed that there was absolute unanimity on our policy towards Ukraine. And understanding that this hold was frivolous and not substantive, and that it was almost certainly an effort to steal an election. The only piece that was missing was whether the president was behind it. The rest of it was clear as day. So going into that phone call, my reverence for the office of the president, even though I knew who Donald Trump was, kind of still was a bit of a block to allowing me to realize that the president was actually the corrupt actor here. But he exposed himself there, and all I did was really report it. And wanted to. The first thing I did was walked into my twin brother's office and said, Eugene, if what I'm about to tell you ever becomes public, the president is going to be impeached. And that was just a recognition of the gravity of the moment. My next step was to report it to senior officials to get them to convince the president to reverse course. The president was notorious within the White House for reversing course. He'd constantly fire off like poorly considered tweets or something else and then have to reverse course. He just didn't like to do it in public. So in reporting it through the proper channels, I thought there was a good chance to get him to reverse course. He would not. One of the skills he had was two skills that he had. One was that he could pick out people's weaknesses and exploit them, and the other one is he had a keen sense for danger, and he knew that Vice President Biden would be his chief contender, and he wouldn't let go of this one, even if he and I don't even know if he was counseled by those attorneys that I made my report to change course, but he was not going to let go. but what I didn't know is I went back to work, went back to trying to get him using my tools, working through the system to get him to reverse course, is that in making that report and in doing my job, I had started the process that would result in congressional notification of the president's wrongdoing. And while I went back to work, not necessarily knowing that I'd kicked off this process, that this was going to lead to the president's impeachment, all I did was make a report as far as I was concerned. By the time we get to September and Congress starts its investigations into the president's hold on security assistance, at that point I know that there's no, I was eventually going to be drawn into the public eye because I'd been the one to report it. I was the White House official responsible for Ukraine, and that if there was any, I don't know if I would describe a great deal of courage in the first report. I knew that the White House was vindictive. I knew that I was going to face challenges. I didn't necessarily know, and I started facing retaliation immediately, but I didn't know that was going to make me a public figure. So by the time it's public, I know that eventually it's going to come around to me, and if the Congress chooses to investigate this, there's no way that I'm going to avoid it. And my twin brother Eugene, he already knows what immediately. He puts the pieces together really quickly. Also because he recognizes I was the one that reported it, so I could have some conversations with him about it. The only thing I could tell my wife is to check on my professional liability insurance to make sure it was in hand in case I needed an attorney. And then it turns out, she reminds me of this when I write the book. It turns out that I roll over and go to sleep, and she's like stays up all night trying to figure out what I just told her. Probably not the coolest thing to do. And then in that time frame, John, I can't talk to my dad about it in detail. I just give him a warning that I'm more than likely going to testify in Congress. And I start to get counsel from my loved ones to figure out like if there's a way to navigate this, if there's a way to preserve my military career. Cut into the end, and I know there's some questions along the way here, so I won't spoil your questions, but ultimately I have to put all these pieces together like I've done, like I allude to in the book throughout my military career, and I take my own counsel. I don't choose to take a kind of a safer path and be a reluctant witness and in some ways suborn the president's scheme by just answering yes or no questions. I attest to what I believed was the president's corruption, the president's abuse of power, his use of coercion, his violation of the Impoundment Act, and a bunch of other things, and really give a full-throated testimony about the president's wrongdoing.
Roz, I don't know if you sort of want to go on to other questions, but
Yeah.
I don't want to sort of monopolize here. So
Well, I would like to jump in here because there were two reactions of people in the book. And one was, if you read the book, there's a great scene where you're driving with your dad. And it reminded me, because I used to drive with my dad. I don't know how many people have had like a conversation in the car, with your parents. And it just reminded me of that. And you're telling him a little bit about what's going on. And his reaction is really interesting. He's really actually quite concerned. His initial reaction is, you shouldn't testify. This is like too much. He's very powerful. This is not going to end well. He's concerned for you. You can hear that. The other reaction, without naming too many names, was on the staff at the NSC, which was another reaction, which was a bunch of people said nothing.
Yeah.
They said nothing. They weren't going to say anything. They decided, it's the president. The president's going to say what he's going to say. The president, I don't know if they were trying to make the argument the president makes policy, not the U.S. government. How did you get through those reactions?
So I think on the latter point, maybe this is a favorable judgment, but I didn't really deliberate on who else was going to say what to whom. I knew that I was a responsible official. We have this saying, when in charge, be in charge. So I was responsible for Ukraine. I knew it was my responsibility the weight fell on my shoulders to report it. It is, I recognize that it could be disappointing that other folks in the room that sense the same kind of impropriety, or some folks didn't have the understanding of what was unfolding. Frankly, there were some unsophisticated actors in there, Trump political appointees. It's just sometimes it was the case that he selected folks that probably weren't qualified to be there, and some folks that did understand, but may have not taken action for whatever reason, maybe partially because of a keen perception of risks and what could happen. Astute in that, I experienced them, and they thought that they might avoid it by not making the same kind of report. But I felt my obligations. I felt them in a visceral way, that the president was trying to compel a foreign government to investigate his opponent to gain an edge in an election. And it's what's interesting about that. There are many different facets to this, but this is a country that it's in a state of war. It would almost be a no-brainer that they would give the president whatever he wanted in order to get the $400 million in security assistance, in order to curry favor with the president, to strengthen the sovereignty of Ukraine. They didn't do that. They actually also, I guess partially, I warned them against doing this months before when I met with President Zelensky, but they also recognized that if this was exposed and the Ukrainians were complicit, they would destroy their relationship with one of the two parties. And I think they tried to hold off for as long as possible. Frankly, what most people don't know is we're only about 48 hours away from the president getting his investigation. And Susan Page from USA Today kind of drew out this counterfactual with me, and walked the dog on it. And on September 11th, the three House committees announced their investigation into the president's hold on security assistance. 2 days later, President Zelensky had for the 13th, he had scheduled an interview with Fareed Zakaria in which he was going to deliver this security assistance, this investigation to get the security assistance released. You have to spend your funds, the congressionally appropriated funds, by the September 30th. So they had held out as long as they could, and it seemed that President Zelensky was about to deliver this investigation, and only because it was announced did they cancel this interview. Now, what's interesting about this is you could imagine that President Zelensky announcing this would cast a shadow over Vice President Biden's campaign in those early days when he was heading into a primary, potentially wound him, and President Biden may have not received he may have not made it through the primaries. He may have not been the nominee. And President Trump wanted him not to be the nominee because he thought he had a better chance of winning against Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders or something of that nature. And we were that close, really, frankly, to getting maybe a second Trump administration. So that's one of the items. With my dad, I'll keep it short and say my dad felt two things when he cautioned me to be careful. One is he understood how power worked. He spent 47 years in the Soviet Union, rose to a fairly significant position in spite of being Jewish and Ukrainian and Soviet leadership being notoriously anti-Semitic. But he still, so he saw power, he understood how it worked. And he knew that going up against the president was going to have some severe costs. Actually, in his context, those costs could be much more severe than we would understand. It's not just losing a job. In his context, he was a young man during Stalin's regime, and he learned about what Stalin did with his purges and the gulags and so forth. It could have been the ultimate cost. So he was channeling that. And then the other thing is that he voted for Trump in 2016. there's a phenomenon amongst the kind of the refugees from communist regimes where their experiences drive them towards a unhealthy type of conservatism, and this is something that we see play out in the electorate in Cuba, the way the Venezuelan population votes, or Vietnamese. So he tended to vote towards the right anyway, and he didn't initially understand what it was that the president had done wrong, and I couldn't explain it to him. It's not until things became public, until President Trump released his transcript, that he understood the whole picture, and then I had him on my side. He just needed the facts, and my mom also forbade Fox News in the house, so that helped. So,
Okay, I think we should go to some audience questions.
Please.
So I don't know. Okay, right here.
Hi, my name is Moon. I have a question. So in such a ridiculed world where we're like almost fighting each other in the US because of political ties and such, and you put yourself at a position where you know who you're working with and so on and so forth, what was the scariest thing about all of this? Because like in one aspect you could have stayed silent almost and not worked with the president of Ukraine, if I got that correctly, and like warned them about all of this, or you could have just like acted in one way and risked a lot of things. What was quite possibly the scariest thing you went through?
Well, so I guess what I'll start with is that I understood the risk and consequences, a balance of the equation also, but I just didn't put that portion of the equation in front of I didn't put my self-interest in front of, I guess, the public good and my obligation to the Constitution of the United States that I'd sworn an oath to. In terms of fears, I wasn't really all that intimidated. I mean, I understood the consequences of potentially losing my position at the White House, one that I think I've indicated how much I cherished, and I was not looking forward to that. But again, I didn't put my own self-interest ahead of what my duties were. I don't know if I fully realized the consequences in that I would also be losing my military career. I tried to use every tool in my arsenal to try to operate through channels. And unlike some whistleblowers where you have to go, they have no other recourse but to maybe go to the press or something of that nature, I had a lot of tools at my disposal. I could basically use the national security process, a process that the president had approved, in order to drag out of these, the shadows, this unfolding conspiracy to pressure the Ukrainians. So I used all those tools. In terms of fears, again, context was important. I had served in combat. I talk about losing our first daughter, which was much more challenging than these types of events. I spent 3 years in Moscow under extremely close scrutiny by the Russian security services. I was not, I guess my daughter says that I'm in charge of fun. My wife is in charge of safety. So I guess that wasn't the part that really bothered me that much. I understood the risks, a large portion of them. I just didn't, and I talk about this idea of in the book about not self-deterring. I try to think about probabilities and consequences, pretty analytical, and I knew I wasn't going to be facing a firing squad like I would potentially be, again, perspective, that I could potentially face in another country if I made the same kind of complaint. I didn't want my country to end up that way, I just did what I did what I thought my duty was, and didn't dwell on the fears.
Thank you.
I'm not sure how helpful that is, but it's
perfectly fine. I actually just a quick follow-up to that, because I think it's very it's easy to overlook the constituents that elect people and certain things like that. And I like how you said you stay true to what you swore an oath to. How do you think we proceed as a nation with our elected officials going on that route?
Well, I think one of the things I've been when my book came out in August, I carpet bombed the airwaves. I was on everything, and one of the themes I talked about was accountability, and I think that's really, frankly, one of the fundamental things we're missing with regards to our political class is they're no longer accountable. You know, the American electorate says something like, well, that's just politics. That's the way politics are played. So the floor keeps dropping further and further for our political actors because we're kind of exposed to people that fall well short of their obligations. Not people that, you know, elected officials should meet a higher bar, not a lower bar than the general public. And I think that's one of the things that really I try to encourage every time I speak. I put down this thought of accountability and making sure we hold our elected officials accountable for their actions. And I think that's probably one of the ways we start to heal our at least the folks that operate in the political sphere. We start selecting better politicians. There are more fundamental issues, I think, that I was actually listening to Fiona Hill's book, which I recommend on the way here. I'm not all the way through it, but it's interesting that she talks about her experience in growing up in northern part of England and socioeconomics, how they drove significant unrest. We're experiencing a lot of those same things here in the United States. And those are the issues that really we need to address. Those are the ones we're seeing the symptoms. Those are the causes. So there needs to be better policy to educate people to transition through the information age so people aren't left behind. But holding people accountable, holding elected officials accountable is a good place to start, at least.
Thank you so much.
Please.
Hi, Ben Wager. You said you mentioned you worked in Moscow under Vasily McFall. Was that he? As I recall, there was a lot of Russian propaganda that kind of contributed to his attack on his character.
Yeah.
And as you move forward into the positions that you had in NSC, were you able to see what the Russian position was in regards to how Trump was handling this situation where he was putting the funds on hold and using this
Yes.
opportunity? Was there a role there that was or some kind of connections, or was there an awareness of the Russian position on this?
So I don't think President Trump's actions were driven by kind of a Russian hand. But too often President Trump's actions fed into Russia's objectives. Everything from Trump's divisive effort, his divisive rhetoric to further drive a wedge between within the U.S. population. That's something that started to unfold relatively early in President Trump's tenure, with him demonizing the press, demonizing the Democrats, and things of that nature. So I think the Russians really didn't have to do a huge amount of work with regards to President Trump, because he was just doing everything. There's a term of art within the kind of the intelligence community about useful idiots, and the Russians were able to effectively use the president on the margins, kind of as a useful idiot. So the president had a predisposition. President Trump had a predisposition to like authoritarianism, like authoritarians. He liked Putin as a strongman. And really, Putin didn't have to do that much to encourage President Trump to say, well, I didn't do this, trust me, take my word for it. And then have President Trump deliver a series of remarks in Helsinki that undermine the credibility of the U.S. intelligence community, and fed into these lies around conspiracy against President Trump. So in that regard, the fundamental question is whether the Russians had dirt on President Trump. I don't know, but they didn't have to use it, is a simple answer. is because they were getting a lot of what they needed from President Trump, just because they had a good assessment of who he was, and how to press his buttons, or let him behave the way he'd want to. And I mean, he's right now, all the things that he's doing with regards to undermining the credibility of U.S. elections, those are well within Russia's objectives to drive keen questions about the effectiveness of democracy, or U.S. democracy as some sort of exemplar for world democracies. And I don't know if there's an effective way to communicate this to President Trump's supporters, that President Trump's actions are enabling and our adversaries, countries that seek to weaken the United States.
Thank you.
So you had experience for the first half of your career as an infantry officer in the Army, policeman, or kind of through any transition into being a foreign area officer. So you had experience fighting, in Iraq, the counterinsurgency, counterterror type campaign. And you had experience dealing with competitions between relatively similar in terms of power, like nation states, such as Russia or China. Do you think that the U.S.'s counterinsurgency campaigns over the past 20 years sort of atrophied the ability, or like took away from the ability to like not just compete with these countries, but like really understand that there's like other nations, that nation states are still like a factor in world affairs, politics, power, war, whatever.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. At the strategic level, yes. At the tactical and operational level, the U.S. military had not been practicing what we call high intensity warfare. So like big land battles against near peer adversaries. But that's not necessarily what kind of emboldened adversaries to seize the moment and be more aggressive. Russia be more aggressive. China, to a certain extent, on the margins, be more aggressive in undermining international norms. I think it's what I would describe as strategic inattention or hyper focus on the Middle East, when in fact the Russians were effectively undermining international norms on a much more significant basis. So imagine Russian excessive claims or a Russian interference with freedom of navigation, setting the conditions for the Chinese to then have excessive claims or impede freedom of navigation in the South China, East China Seas, or same thing with regards to the North Sea routes along the Arctic. So those types of things are because we were hyper focused or inattentive to what states were doing. We were looking at, we had troops on the ground in the Middle East. That's where our attention was, and therefore we weren't paying attention to some of these other issues going on. That's actually part of the thesis for my doctoral dissertation. Is I'm working on a history of U.S. Policy towards Russia and Ukraine since the end of the Cold War, and I think there's something to be said that our adversaries observed that this was a moment where they could get away with more than they would have if the U.S. wasn't hyper focused on the Middle East, wasn't involved in counterinsurgency, wasn't committing thousands of troops and trillions of dollars to military campaign. And I think that's right. I think they did seize that opportunity.
Thank you.
In fact, did you ever get any indication to what Zelensky thought of what you did?
Of what I did?
Yeah.
I have in the course of my interviews for my doctoral work, I'm conducting interviews with U.S. and Ukrainian decision makers. I've done 2 rounds of those in Ukraine, and those were with former presidents, ministers of foreign affairs, heads of security services, And in the courses of those interviews, I've talked to a couple of people that were on the other side of that phone call
Yeah.
on the Ukrainian side, that was recently, so that wasn't in the book. But they did. They knew exactly what was going on. That Trump was putting the squeeze on them, and they knew exactly what they were what was expected of them to deliver. And frankly, they were prepared and crafty at maneuvering around delivering on President Trump's intentions for as long as they could, and they were under pressure. You know, they're not going to say it. They don't want, even now, they're even with Trump out of office. That's not something that they need. You know, a president of a foreign country is not going to say, like, I felt keen pressure to deliver on this. That's not the strong man image that the population expects, and that would also not align with what he had said on the record previously. And we're probably not going to get public commentary to that effect, but talking to folks behind the scenes, yes, they felt significant pressure. And you know, I didn't ask the question of, like, what would have happened, but I didn't want to put these folks on the spot, folks that I've had some that I know and worked with in the past. So but yes, they knew exactly what was going on, what was expected.
Thank you.
So my question is about American institutions. So over the last like 4 years or so, you've seen like a mass exodus of career civil servants leaving like the State Department and other U.S. agencies. How does that loss of knowledge and experience kind of affect those institutions? And what is kind of your assessment of the health of our institutions?
I think that's a very astute assessment. I think we have had a exodus of sorts, and I think that part of this, part of the harm to good governance in the United States was 4 years of Trump tenure, in which he tried to reform these institutions, these departments and agencies into not necessarily his own image, but into much more pliable organizations. And people had to make decisions about whether they could stay in government or actually, like, put on the spot about doing something that they didn't feel right about and leave. And part of the legacy, the lasting legacy of these kinds of erosion of good governance. And, you know, I saw it kind of unfold with my own eyes, initially with the Department of Justice, Department of State, the intelligence community, eventually with the Department of Defense, is that you had a number of really excellent career public servants leave. And this is a magnification of sorts of the kind of exodus that's been occurring as political actors, mainly on the right, have seen some expediency in attacking the idea that public servants serve the public good. They're credible and capable, and we're certainly going to start feeling the effects of that as time wears on. I think if we had 4 more years of Trump, we would have ended up with completely different institutions, and probably a different cohort of folks coming into those positions. I think the damage done is pretty reversible. I'd like I'm a glass half full kind of person. So I've had folks come up to me and tell me that they decided or started considering a career in government because they saw this cohort of public servants testify and demonstrate kind of the excellence of public servants. These are the folks, the Masha Ivanoviches, the Fiona Hills, the Bill Taylors, the George Kents, Laura Cooper, just to name a few of them. And I think I'm not sure if there's a easy prescription to do this. I know that I've taken it as a commitment for myself to be active and try to advocate and speak about what public servants do for the country. I know that my fellow public servants kind of feel the same way, and I'm not sure. I don't have a good answer to how to fix this. I could tell you what you already know is that we've lost excellent people. I could try to encourage people to consider public servants, you know, and not to belabor this point, but I think you should see public service as a means to become the person who you want to be, practice a set of values and maintain an ethic to help you overcome greater challenges. I talk about this in the form of like you're exercising your ethics and values muscles, because you do this, you're oriented externally towards the public good instead of your own good. And I think, you know, that might be a way that resonates with people that want to figure out how to overcome the challenges of life and navigate these challenges in a manner that they would hope they could. In terms of systemic stuff, I don't know if I have got good solutions.
I would agree with you. Where I see a big disconnect is people who work in public service, talking about public service, about the people they're working around are some of the smartest and brightest people the US has to offer, while the general public has this complete distrust of American institution or just the government in general. Do you have any sense of how to like kind of bridge that gap?
I do. I think maybe you did you participate or in our conversation at the top of the stairs?
Yeah,
Okay, so yeah. So just to quickly rehash, I think there's a, you know, where one side, again, the Republicans see utility in talking about bloated government and demonizing public service and there is no counterweight to that kind of voice and to a slow erosion of people's faith in good governance. There used to be some institutions that actually could advocate for the executive branch and policies. And I'm on the board of something called the Renewed Democracy Initiative. It's a non-governmental organization, bipartisan group of folks that try to, you know, come up with some creative solutions. There was and some of these solutions existed in the past. There was a office within the executive office of the president that was responsible for public diplomacy, advocating for what it was the executive branch did. That's one of the things that I think that's an area where we could probably, it's an office that needs to be reestablished at a high enough level where they could talk about what the president's policies are. They could talk about what the Department of, I think Department of Defense is an easy one. It's a kind of a understood and well regarded, but what is it that Department of State does with regards to foreign aid? What is it that Department of Commerce does? What is it that Department of Interior and Education and Treasury, what do they do? And explain that to the public. And that's an area where we could, frankly, the executive branch needs to apply some resources and improve their communication with the general public.
I will say coming to World Affairs Council of New Jersey meetings is one way you can do that. So yeah, but like grassroots and, you know, institution building that's not just always top down, but bottom up too. It's also important.
Please.
On the, I'm Mel, nice to meet you. On the how to fix things, you know, you talk a lot about accountability, so I was just curious if you have any thoughts about solving the issue of accountability with upcoming presidents or policymakers.
Yeah, well, what I try to do is I use my voice to now I use my voice to advocate for public servants that have upheld their oaths of office and cast a light on those that have fallen short. So that's one thing that I try to do personally. I try to encourage people to vote. It's both a privilege and an obligation of citizens to vote. That's an important thing to do. I think you guys in this state have a fairly close election. I'm not going to put anybody on the spot, but hopefully everybody in here has voted or intends to vote and make their voice heard. I think in places like WACA that could, World Affairs Council in New Jersey, educating people on basic civics is a critical importance. Maybe even offering a platform for the public servants to speak to the community in a kind of elevated moderated way where people could express their views in a relatively in a benign environment, but also at the same time holding them on the spot and calling them if they're deceitful, because that happens too often. So I think those things are important. But I think in terms of institutional changes, I'm pretty good. I diagnose a lot of issues. I'm less able to come up with really creative solutions, and I've been on the hunt for these things in my various capacities to hear some good solutions on how to fix how to strengthen our democracy. None of them are easy. They're all kind of systemic issues. Retooling the population for the information age, putting those people that are in the Rust Belt, the people that don't believe that the economy and politicians serve their interests, giving those people opportunities is a way to fix it. That is a very, very complex issue that requires a role at the local, state, federal level in order to come up with some ways to bring people into the 21st century where they have opportunities. That's not necessarily something that I think maybe selecting very good public officials that have those kinds of visions, as opposed to folks that are cultural warriors and talk about issues that like critical race theory is kind of like, just a hot button issue, a trigger of some sort. Electing people on the basis of substance instead of rhetoric is a place to look.
Okay, I think we have time for maybe one more question. Yeah,
Please.
Teresa.
So I'm curious how you navigated the dynamic between soldier and commanding officer, because the president is, your commander in chief
Yeah.
as a member of the military. So how did you navigate that in making your decision to come forward? And also, how would you respond to critics who, criticized you for maybe disobeying an order?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Something that I dwelled on for quite a bit in terms of understanding what my obligations were. It is a strange place to be, where I, as a director on the National Security Council, a active duty Army officer, was in a position where I was defending the Constitution of the United States, and the president was acting against U.S. national security interests and subverting the Constitution of the United States. I did not miss that. That was a very strange position to be in. I pondered over the question of what would my obligations would be if the president had ordered me not to testify. He didn't. He gave there was a blanket kind of guidance of sorts that he didn't want anybody in the executive branch to testify, but that's not the same thing as the president ordering me not to do it. So if he had ordered me not to do it, I would have had to let it play out in the courts. I knew that was a kind of a point of clarity. I would have had no choice. I couldn't disobey unless his order was illegal. I couldn't disobey it. And I don't know if you could make the call that the president ordering me not to testify is an illegal order per se. Like telling me to do something that explicitly violates the law, arguably. Like what simplified this for me is that I also had my understanding of the way the government's supposed to work, that there's a legislative branch had oversight and is supposed to be a check on the executive branch. We have 3 co-equal branches of government. And in my case, it was pretty apparent that absent the president ordering me not to testify, the Congress asking me to appear pursuant to a subpoena, that was where my obligations were. So it was pretty easy to really, in that case, make a judgment call while still kind of marveling over the fact that the commander-in-chief was, again, subverting U.S. national security, and I had a duty to prevent that, or at least report it.
Okay, well, could everybody please join me in thanking Alex for